Hi guys, I'm sure you know that king is a very important piece, and generally speaking it's very vulnerable in the opening and also in the middle game. We definitely need to make sure that it's safe, that it's safeguarded by our pawns, that the opponent doesn't get the chance to construct an attack against our king. However, in this video I would like to show you a different aspect connected with playing with the king. This in fact is going to involve playing with the king very actively, of course under very specific circumstances, which is going to be the endgame. So we're going to discuss how to properly take advantage of your king in the endgame, how to use it actively, and as a matter of fact, the example I'm going to show you is taken from a game played by one of those grandmasters you would never expect to create such a strategic masterpiece. I'm talking about Mikhail Tal, the wizard of Riga, of course known for his attacking abilities. So the game I'm going to discuss was played between Tal and Lisitsyn. As another Soviet player, I'm not really sure how strong he was, but we can assume that, well, if he played Tal, he must have presented a certain level. So knight f3, d6, we have the dragon Sicilian, and here Tal played f4, which is of course not the main move. If you decide to play the dragon as with white pieces, you generally opt for a setup with bishop e3, f3, queen d2, and bishop to c4, followed by castling queenside. However, in this specific game, Tal went for the less explored f4 move, which is actually quite poisonous. There are certain lines that you might be interested in, however, this is not really an opening video, so in case you'd like to surprise your opponent once or twice, you may find this line interesting. Generally speaking, white prepares a very quick e5 break, which may present some problems to an unexperienced black player. Lisitsyn went knight c6, which is well, the main response. Knight c6, pawn takes c6, e5. As mentioned before, this is the thematic idea, and it's not really surprising that Tal went for it. Knight d7, this is the principled way of meeting this line, this move. Pawn takes d6, pawn takes d6, and bishop e3. So what white is trying to prove here is that since black already exposed his long diagonal, meaning that he played g6, and of course this was connected with preparation of the development of the bishop to g7. So now Tal is trying to prove that this is a bit awkward for black to both try to develop the bishop to g7 and at the same time meet some threats connected with just queen takes d6. So simply saying that the bishop cannot both be developed to g7 and protect the pawn on d6, which apparently wasn't really a big problem for Lisitsyn, who played bishop e7 in this position, apparently just preparing castling kingside, and as you're going to see in a moment, he's going to play d5. So here Tal played queen f3, which seems like a logical move. Analysis proves that perhaps a different setup was to be preferred. Generally speaking, queen d2, and after castling kingside, white can either go in a more peaceful way, bishop e2, d5, and kingside castle, or instead, in this position, he can of course opt for the move which is really in the spirit of the dragon Sicilian, which is queenside castle, followed by some aggressive attempts on kingside. Of course, here we have a question: who's going to be faster? The problem for white is that he is still to open the H file in order to get any attacking prospects, and at the same time black can already use his B file, for example by putting the rook there and already trying to create certain threats on queenside against the white king. So this wasn't what the game, how the game went. Instead there was queen f3, d5, queenside castle, bishop to f6. It was possible to play kingside castle. Apparently this was even stronger. Here Tal went for bishop d4. I assume he just needed to neutralize this powerful bishop on the long diagonal, even though it first went to e7 and only then to f6 instead of the standard bishop g7 development. It really became a very powerful piece. So Tal chose to play bishop d4. As a side note, I wouldn't really be myself if I didn't mention this really surprising and eye-pleasing opportunity, bishop to b5. It's quite surprising that Tal didn't really try to muddy the waters with a move like that. It's a really poisonous idea, and the perfect example is shown in case black actually accepts the sacrifice. So when c takes b5 is played, after knight takes d5, it transpires that black's position is a little bit awkward. Black really lacks certain piece coordination, and of course the main threat is just capturing on f6 followed by capturing the rook on a8. And for instance, if black goes rook b8, white can just capture on f6, queen takes f6, and then bishop to d4. Of course, this is going to be followed by winning the exchange on h8, simply collecting the rook. And also, let's not forget that the black king is quite vulnerable, and white, of course, could still try to create some kind of an attack, even just simply playing rook h to e1. So this is definitely winning. The problem with this line is that black can simply ignore it, and after bishop b5, play bishop b7. However, this would have been a much stronger option as compared to the game continuation. Basically, the bishop doesn't belong on b7. Black would like to keep his b file open and available for the rook. The bishop on b7 is going to be surprisingly misplaced. Even though it seems like a developed piece, it doesn't really work well with black's original idea. In any case, let's go back to the game. Bishop d4 was played, castles, h4, so Tal is pretending to be interested in attacking on kingside. This was actually, I'm sure, his idea. However, this never really took place on the board. So black went rook b8. It was possible to continue the game with another move, bishop takes d4, followed by rook takes d4, and then queen b6. With this move, black actually gets a tempo, so white is forced to retreat with the rook, and then we can assume that rook b8 is going to take place with quite promising play for black. However, the black player chose simply rook b8, threatening to take on d4, followed by queen b6. So this is also quite decent try. White played queen f2, rook b4, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, a3, attempting to simply kick the rook back. It was placed quite actively, not only attacking the pawn on b2, but also hitting this pawn on f4. So Tal felt like, playing a3 is not going to damage the pawn structure on queenside significantly, and at the same time it's actually going to achieve something, which is driving the rook away from its active post. And here, to I assume everyone's surprise, including Tal, instead of continuing this kind of play with initiative for black, since of course the b file is already open, Lisitsyn just played queen b6. Analysis also proves that both rook b8 and rook b7, so rook b7 protects the pawn on a7, rook b8 doesn't, but the big question is whether white even wants to take the pawn, because that seems like quite a ambitious try, to put it very mildly. It's definitely bold, but it can backfire at the same time. So instead of that, Lisitsyn chose to play queen b6, and after the exchange, we have the endgame, or you could say complex middle game, complex endgame perhaps, or simplified middle game. This is the proper evaluation of this position. And let's fast forward a little bit. Rook b7, bishop d3, knight h5, rook h to f1, rook e7. So far so good. Both players play relatively in a relatively understandable fashion. And now Tal just played f5, which is quite understandable. Basically, he's trying to reduce the number of pawns that could potentially be under attack. Also, black had this potential idea of playing knight g3, and then who knows, perhaps even connected with establishing a blockade on f5 square. f5, pawn takes f5, rook f2 e1, so this was a legitimate pawn sacrifice. Please note that bishop takes f5 runs into knight g3, forking the rook and the bishop, so that was never really on the table. Rook e1, rook e8, takes, and now we have the moment of the game which is the most interesting for us. Tal is down a pawn. It's not really clear what he's going to do, what he's supposed to do. Whenever he plays rook f1, attempting to win this pawn on f5 back, well, this is not even going to create a threat, because as mentioned before, black always has this idea of playing knight g3. Also, whenever rook f1 is played, black can even play f4, pushing the pawn forward and making it more powerful in the context of the endgame. It can, after all, potentially be promoted if certain things happen on the board. So Tal just realized that, well, he has the same number of pieces on the board. However, well, he cannot improve the rook, he cannot improve the bishop. The knight could potentially be placed on c5, but it's going to make a good impression. It's not really going to attack anything. However, most of black's pawns are placed on light squares, which means that dark squares are certainly vulnerable. They can be used. Due to the lack of dark squared bishop, well, on one hand, white cannot dominate those squares easily, but at the same time, black will not be able to control those squares. So Tal just came up with this fantastic idea of simply infiltrating opponent's position with his own king. Have a look. King d2. So first he's just controlling a couple of central squares, in particular the e3 one, which could be used by the black rook in order, for example, to play rook e3 followed by rook g3, of course putting pressure on the pawn on g2. Here Lisitsyn played knight g3, which is still fine. King c3, you might be wondering where the king is going. f4, and now king d4. So the number of the pieces is the same. Both players have the rook, bishop, knight, but also they have the kings. And as compared to Lisitsyn, Tal is using his king very actively. This king is about to attack the pawn on c6 by going to c5, and this actually is going to present a huge threat to black. Lisitsyn played bishop f5, and analysis also shows that bishop g4 would have been much stronger, but again, the devil is in the details. If you're interested in this position, feel free to analyze it on your own. I strongly encourage you to do that. It's a very interesting position. However, for the sake of time efficiency, let's just skip it. So bishop f5, and now a bit of prophylaxis, rook d2, because after the exchange of the bishops, of course, we don't want to see the black rook penetrating along the second, because that would lead to loss of too many precious pawns. So black went rook e6, and this is also a bit imprecise, you could say. White plays knight c5, rook h6, and here came king e5. So white is really dominating on those dark squares, using this powerful knight on c5 and his king on e5. It looks like basically, okay, white is down a pawn, but at the same time he has an extra piece. he doesn't have it in the proper sense, but he's using it so efficiently that, well, effectively it is a surplus piece. Bishop takes d3, pawn takes back, rook h4, and now the king is just unstoppable. King d6. In fact, it's not only this pawn on c6 that is in danger. If you look at this position closely, White's plan basically involves creating a passed pawn. In the endgames, you have to really try to create powerful threats, and this often involves creating a passer so that, well, it's going to be potentially a queen. So of course king takes c6 is a move which directly well, minimizes the loss, the material loss that White currently has. However, this might not even be the strongest, because king c7, king b7 followed by king takes a7 leads to creation of the passer. So if black is given if black gives White enough time, this pawn is just going to become very dangerous. So I would actually assume this was White's primary idea. Rook h6 was played, and now king c7. So, well, Lisitsyn forced Tal to attack the more important pawn, but I think Tal wanted to do that anyway. Knight f5 was played, king b7 as mentioned before, knight d4, so Lisitsyn already realized what the danger is, and he tries to at least slow White down. And there was rook f2 here. Funny enough, despite the lack of two pawns, despite the material deficit that White has, this position is already winning. There were certain moments a moment ago where Black could have improved on his play, but right now it's way too late. So a5, rook takes a4, knight e6. White is not yet interested in trading the knights, at least not by capturing on e6. Rook g4 check, king f8 and king c6. All of a sudden, the material is even, and White just enjoys a better endgame. Why? Because his pieces are more active, and thanks to this very powerful king, it will be very easy for White to simply challenge all of Black's weak pawns. Let's take a look at the way Tal converted. This is just going to be very quick. Rook e6, king takes d5, already White is up a pawn, rook b6, and as mentioned before, when you have the endgame, in particular the rook endgame, what you want to do is to simply create a passer. A passer is just, well, a guarantee of at least great hopes. In this case, it's a guarantee of a success, because the black king is going to be very easily cut off along the d4, along the d file, using rook d4. And the rest is just history. This is kindergarten conversion of the advantage. King b6, king c7. We simply create this motorway for the b pawn. And as you see, Tal nursed the pawn to promotion. Really impressive performance by Tal, especially when you know his style, which was basically to try to get access to the opponent's king, sacrifice as many pieces as you can, and just try to deliver checkmate. In this case, he proved to be a very he proved to be a player with great positional understanding. He knew that his best chance was connected with using all of his pieces, and I'm saying all of the pieces, not just minor pieces in the rook. All of the pieces, meaning that the king is supposed to be involved in the game. Keep in mind that the king is considered to be worth as many as 4 points in the endgame, so, well, it's slightly worse than a rook, but also stronger than minor pieces. So you really want to use this potential, and well, if you do that, I'm pretty sure your endgame play is going to be much, much better. I hope you enjoyed that one, and thanks for watching.